Sri, thank you very, very much for that generous introduction. It reminded me of the old line that Lyndon Johnson used to use. I wish my parents had been here for that. My father would have appreciated it, and my mother would have believed it. And it's good to come to a nerdy place like the World Bank because you don't get introduced with the economist jokes that I too often am introduced with. It wasn't so long ago that the guy said, Larry, do you know what it takes to succeed as an economist? And I said, no. And he said, an economist is someone who's pretty good with figures, but doesn't quite have the personality to be an accountant. That was in Moscow, and no one got the joke. I am really glad to be here. I'm going to dedicate my remarks today to my late father, who devoted much of his career to the development of price statistics through the International Comparison Project. When I was a boy, that was a project that was taking a one-off snapshot laboriously of 10 countries. Over time, 10 countries became 16 countries, and 16 countries became 40 countries, and a snapshot became the continuous Penn World Tables, and ultimately the work was institutionalized at the World Bank, and today is made use of in the world's official economic statistics. That would not have happened without the World Bank's recognition of the importance of data. And so everyone who's a little younger than I should understand that the World Bank has been making a major contribution to the global statistical effort, literally for a substantial number of decades. And Sri, I thank you, I thank Jim Kim, I thank the previous presidents of the World Bank for their dedication to what I regard as a profoundly important effort. I want to assert 4 propositions this morning for your consideration. First, and you will come to see, I hope, how this one relates to your conference's themes. The standard history of science, as you have learned it, is mostly wrong. The proposition that you all learned in some version of your high school classes, and that we are told each day, is what Freeman Dyson has called the Thomas Kuhn view of the history of science. And the idea is that there's a theory, and then somebody thinks hard about the theory and realizes predictions that the theory makes, and then tests those predictions. And sometimes the predictions are confirmed, but eventually some prediction is found and the experiments do not confirm the prediction, and then a new hypothesis is developed, and then that hypothesis is developed, is tested, and it is improved, and ultimately science progresses through hypothesis testing and experimenting. And the narrative we all learn is that science drives large parts of human progress, and hypothesis testing and experiment drive science. And there are obviously areas in which that is true. When the perihelion of Mercury was observed, it was a great victory for Einstein's general theory of relativity. But what recent scholarship has demonstrated, led in particular by my Harvard colleague, Peter Galison, is that a very large part of science actually progresses just by looking. Better information and simple observation drive science. What led the world after 1,500 years of believing in Ptolemaic astronomy with the Earth at the center of the universe to come to understand that planets orbited the sun and moons orbited planets? It was the invention of the telescope and the observation, which you could see very simply with your own eyes, that moons were orbiting Jupiter. And then there wasn't any other argument to be had anymore. The most important discovery in the history of biology was the cell. How was it made? Leeuwenhoek, I just sure mispronounced that name, developed the microscope, and people looked in the microscope at water and they saw bacteria cells, and then they knew there were cells. And I could proliferate these examples. If you think about the discovery of the structure of the atom, which underlies everything about radioactivity, everything about nuclear power, it is a consequence of particle accelerators and simple inference from those particle accelerators. So what actually drives progress, as much as all this philosophical stuff about hypothesis testing, is the ability to observe better. And with the ability to observe better, things which were formerly difficult to see or impossible to understand became self-evident, and progress was made. That drives me to my second observation. If mathematics is, as is often said, the queen of the sciences, statistics are the queen of the social sciences. Let me give you a few examples of the power of statistics to make obvious what was previously almost unimaginable. If you read a health book giving people advice about healthy habits written before 1946, that book will tell you not under any circumstances to over-exercise. It will be explained to you in that book that if you over-exercise, you might put strain on your heart and cause yourself to have a heart attack. It will further be explained that when you exercise, you get hungry and you eat more, and so exercise makes you fat. How did the world learn that that was wrong? Not, I promise you, because some cardiologist had a theory about strengthening the heart muscles. Not, I promise you, because someone had a theory about exercise promoting the flow of blood to the brain and then tested that theory. No, as part of a broad statistical understanding at improving health, in the United Kingdom, they did a broad survey of many, many workers, and particularly public employees, and asked them all kinds of questions about their lives and their subsequent health status, thinking that they would learn something. And they observed, because it leapt out at them as a huge fact, that bus conductors on double-decker buses had half the heart attack rate that bus drivers did. And if you think about that observation for only 30 seconds, there can only be one explanation. Bus conductors were, if anything, of lower socioeconomic status than bus drivers. It's just that on double-decker buses, bus conductors were climbing up and down the stairs all day. And they had half the heart attack rate. And we went from having no idea to knowing the answer just because there was a lot of data around and somebody looked at that shrewdly. Give you another example from the health field. It was, and you can argue about this, somewhere between 15 and 40 years from the time when statisticians noticed that people who smoked more died more, till the time when anybody provided a theory of what exactly it was in nicotine or tar that biologically did damage to people's lungs. Again, data and staring told us hugely important things for human welfare that we did not previously know. My last example is 2 orders of magnitude more trivial than the 2 I have just mentioned, but I think illustrates the pervasive application of the point. If one had had to imagine a sphere in which analytics and statistics and statistical research would be useless, I think it would be hard to imagine a sphere more plausible for that conclusion than baseball. And yet, I would submit for your consideration that Moneyball is a text for our times. What it showed was that all kinds of things that baseball knew, it knew from experience, that sacrifice bunts were a good idea with 1 out. This is a very international audience, so I realize not everybody is going to get this reference, and if I were more adroit than I am, I would be using a soccer or football analogy, but I promise the baseball will pass soon. Or that short guys who are hard to pitch to got a lot of walks, and a walk was 85% as good as a single. These changed who was deemed a good baseball player and who was not deemed a good baseball player. Well, if statistics can tell you who will play baseball well, better than making people run the 40-yard dash or measuring their reflex time, think about how many other areas they have the potential to transform. So it's ultimately observation and common sense rather than genius that drives scientific progress. And it's ultimately statistics that enable us to look and see phenomena and observe what is happening that make statistics so central to progress in modern life. My third observation: technology is transforming all of this. When my father wrote his PhD thesis when I was a little boy, he actually would go to the computer and would go behind the computer. And when he wanted to add numbers, he'd put one set of wires into their sockets. And when he wanted to subtract numbers, he would put a different set of wires into their sockets. About 15 years after that, the Apollo project sent a man to the moon with orbits that were all calculated on sophisticated computers and telecommunication systems that were based on what were then modern communication technologies. At that time, my family was living in London, and because it was so expensive, only twice during the year did we call my grandmother in New York, and my mother rehearsed her children in giving their messages to their grandmother, so that we could give them quickly, so that the phone call would not last too long. That was 15 years after we were plugging wires in. This device has about 15 times the computing power that the entire Apollo project had. This device. And there are today 2 billion of them in human circulation. And it is a prediction that one can make confidently that within a decade, there will be more of these than there will be adults on planet Earth. Now, admittedly, there'll be some people in Hong Kong who will own 4 of them. So the fact that there will be more of these than there are people on planet Earth doesn't quite mean that everyone will have one. But it does mean that a very, very large fraction of all the people who are on planet Earth will have these devices. In fact, they will never, in most cases, have personal computers. They will never make a phone call that's transmitted over a phone wire. They will leapfrog the technologies that have defined our adult lives. Sri, when I think about this, I think about what was an enormously meaningful experience for me. In 1979, I had my first experience visiting a developing country. At the time, the Harvard Institute for International Development had a major project advising your country, and I was a very junior member of a team that advised Mr. Widjojo, and in particular advised Ali Wardana, who was one of your predecessors as finance minister. And I went to Indonesia, and it was a hugely meaningful experience in all sorts of ways for me. But I'll just comment on an unimportant aspect. I was at the time a passionate Red Sox fan. They're the Boston baseball team, for those of you who don't know. A passionate Red Sox fan. And when the Red Sox played on Monday night, I wanted to know what happened. And when did I learn what happened? I would learn on Thursday. Why would I learn on Thursday? Because the game would be completed too late to get into the Tuesday International Herald Tribune. And so it would get into the Wednesday International Herald Tribune. And the Wednesday International Herald Tribune would get to the Barabador Hotel near the finance ministry at 4 in the afternoon on Thursday. and there was no CNN, there was no cable TV, there was no TV in English in my hotel room, and it cost 1 day's salary to make a 4-minute phone call to the United States, and I didn't want to know about the Red Sox that much. And so it was Monday until Thursday before I knew what happened to the Red Sox. And yet, anyone backpacking in Sumatra today would take it for granted that they could be instantly in touch. And so we live in an entirely different world of technology, and therefore we live in an entirely different world in terms of the capacity to produce data and information than we have ever lived in before. Some of it, the least part of it, is simply we can use these tools to collect data in ways that are far more efficient and far more rapid than we previously envisioned. That's why something like the Billion Prices Project at MIT that can provide daily price information is so important. That's why I'm so excited to be a director and be involved with Premise and its capacity to mobilize these technologies as widely as possible. That's why Planet Labs, with its capacity to scan and monitor environmental conditions, represents such a profound innovation. But I think there's actually something even deeper going on, which is that the processes of data collection and the processes of carrying out the phenomena about which the data is being connected are becoming ever more organically related. I think of an example, one of the more important apps on my iPhone is Waze. What is Waze? Waze basically is a system that scans where I am as I drive around, sees how rapidly I'm moving, makes a judgment about traffic congestion, integrates that judgment about how dense it is where I am with the density where thousands of other people are, and then recommends routes to all of us so that we all get where we are going more rapidly. The more people who use it, the better the data gets. The better the data gets, the better the advice gets. The better the advice gets, the more people use it. And it's an enormously positive feedback loop. And increasingly, we are seeing that in more and more areas. New technology, new forms of partnership, new relations between the measurement process and the actual process that is being measured, all of this is creating a revolution in technology. My fourth observation: this will change the world vastly for the better because data is the ultimate public good. I remember a moment when I was fairly young that was an important part of why I decided to become an economist and to focus on macroeconomics. I understood that there were all these people who argued about how the economy worked, and then when they argued about how the economy worked, it affected the policies that countries pursued, and then those policies affected the economic outcomes. And I realized that if we achieved, something I was able to do at some point in my life, led to the unemployment rate in the United States being 0.1% lower for 1 month. That would mean 160,000 fewer people out of work. That would mean several 100,000 children who didn't see their father or mother be discouraged by losing a job. That would mean tens of billions of dollars of income more for families trying to meet their budgets. And I thought about 0.1% of unemployment for 1 month would have that kind of impact on tens, hundreds of thousands of people. And I thought about the impact that a teacher or a doctor or a marketer could have. And it seemed to me that just because the causal chain might be longer between thinking about economics and data and outcomes, just because it was a longer causal chain, and I wouldn't ever see the particular person I might have helped, and certainly no one would say thank you, that it was no less morally important. And I would suggest to you that the projects in which you are all engaged in better measurement have the potential to be worth far, far, far more than 0.1% on the unemployment rate for 1 month. Consider this. The central planetary goals that have been set by the world's leaders of every major country are the Sustainable Development Goals. Most people in this room understand them better than I, and there certainly are more of them. You know, there's not quite one of them for every citizen in the developing world, but we are in that direction. But there are people who understand them more, but I think I don't paint with too broad a brush if I say that global poverty is central to them. And yet, the most recent accurate data we have for many crucial countries is 2011. Now, you could say that there are long lags. You could say that it's really hard to collect data. You could say that really it's very, very difficult and very, very complicated. And the data is 2011. It is very hard, it is very complicated, it is very long. Here is what I am here to tell you. World War II was very long and very complicated and involved vast mobilization. It took 3.5 years from the time the United States entered World War II till the time that the United States won World War II. And yet the most recent data we have available on what we've identified as an absolutely central indicator is 5 years old. How many ministers? 3. Stay in office as finance minister for 5 years. Not very many. And you know what? I think you'll agree with me as a finance minister that altruistic as you are, altruistic as I was when I was a finance minister, I cared more about what happened while I was finance minister than I cared what happened when my predecessor was finance minister, or I cared about what happened when my successor was finance minister. And so making data available in real time is central to having that data be acted on. It is central to having that data galvanize political action. It is central to having that data make a difference. That might once have been true, but impossible to act on. It is possible to act on today. Today, when I am in Jakarta, I can know what happened in the Red Sox game about 3 nanoseconds after it happens. And there's no reason why we cannot, in continuous time, monitor what is happening across this planet. That carries with it many, many benefits. It carries with it that we get the information instantaneously. It carries with it the adage that what you count counts. Let me, if I could, give you one more example. The world is doing today, and again, this is something that people can argue about, and I'm painting with a broad brush. The world is doing substantially better with respect to global climate change today than one might reasonably have expected it would be doing 2 years ago. Not well enough, but it is doing better. In large part, that is driven by an increased and an enhanced Chinese commitment to addressing these challenges. Of course, that's primarily driven by what is happening or what is not happening in the Chinese environment. But I would submit that the fact that the most common app on iPhones in Beijing is AQI, air quality indicators, has a great deal to do with the energy that China is devoting to this problem. Measurement matters, observation counts, and it drives action. And that's why data is so important. 2 final observations as part of making the case for data, if I might. Spending, knowing how much is spent without knowing what prices are, is meaningless. If you told me that my height was 50, that would be an entirely uninformative statement, unless you told me that I was 50 inches or 50 yards or 50 meters or 50 parsecs or 50 something. Telling me my height was 50 would be utterly without meaning. Likewise, saying that somebody spent 60 without telling them anything about what 60 was, or simply identifying 60 as 60 of a certain piece of paper, the rupiah, is meaningless as well. And so no economic data are of any real meaning at all without prices. Just as in the same way that no height data has any meaning at all without units. So when you work on price statistics, you are at one level working on one piece of the broad puzzle of economic data. But you are at another level opening the key to understanding, or using the key to unlock all of what is going on in the economy. There are no statistics more fundamental than price statistics. A final thought. Thomas Watson was a visionary at IBM. He estimated in the 1960s that the global demand for computers would be 5 to 10. Not 5 to 10 billion, not 5 to 10 million, not 5 to 10 100,000, not 5 to 10,000, 5 to 10. In the late 1970s, AT&T had conceptualized what we today call the cell phone. They couldn't really see why, with payphones around, anybody would have any great desire to carry around a cell phone, except for maybe a few super important people. And so they thought the global demand for cell phones would be about 10,000. My favorite cartoon is of a little boy being asked what he wants to do when he grows up and answering a job that has not been invented yet. As with Moneyball, as with those British conductors, the one thing that I can promise you is that vastly better data collection will produce benefits that we can foresee, but even greater benefits that no one in this room can imagine. And that is why data is the ultimate public good, why meetings like this are so important, why the work you are doing is so important, and why, if I might, Madam Vice President, the work of the World Bank in supporting data, in supporting the ultimate public good, is as important for the long run as any other work the World Bank does. Thank you very much.
Many thanks indeed, Larry Summers, for those uplifting remarks. Larry's got an appointment he needs to get to fairly swiftly. So what I'm going to do is just open it up to 3 questions only. I'm afraid that's all we've got for us. So statistics would suggest there's a big premium on those 3. So if we can bundle them together to make the best use of Larry's time, there's a microphone here. So the lucky 3, fortunate 3, let's think what else rhymes with 3. Okay, I'm going to stop. Please use the microphone here so that our online audience worldwide can hear us. By the way, so glad you like Moneyball. Love that movie. My wife's a big Red Sox fan from Boston. Come on, friends, going once. If you would like to ask Larry a question, put your hands up. Great to see this young guy. Yep. We always need a pioneer in public policy. Shoot, go ahead.
Mr. Summers, thanks for talking. I'm Zach Noble. I write for Federal Computer Week. I was wondering if you could talk about the specific technologies that you've seen for the capture of price data. And you kind of alluded to this, differences between the developing world, the United States. Specifically here in the U.S., what technologies do you see the federal government using to best capture and improve price data? Thank you.
It's a good question, but one of the things I've learned painfully is when you're in a room where there are 50 people who know more about the specifics than you do, it's usually a bad idea to opine on the specifics. So I won't go further than to observe that the capacity to do what I don't think even 15 years ago I would have envisioned as linked activities, telephoning and photographing. That ability, I think, is something that is hugely important. And so I would imagine that the use of mobile devices and the transmission of mobile device information to central repositories where it can be processed will ultimately be transformative of price collection processes. And when it's transformative of price collection processes, will transform economic statistics more broadly. And I would guess that's an area where you'll see more and more similarity between the private and the public, not so much between the private sector and the public sector, as between what's happening in the industrial world and what's happening in the developing world.
Larry, thanks very much. Yes.
Thank you very much. Larry Martin Rama, Chief Economist for South Asia. You may not remember me. You hired me into the bank 25 years ago. Talking about technology.
It's an important part of my legacy and one that I will always treasure.
Thank you very much. In our support to statistical development, we try really to beef up statistical agencies to get programs going under statistical programs, their surveys and all that. Technology opens up a way to bypass and go quicker, like through the internet. Today, how will you see the balance about going through technology and going through institutional development at the country level? What is the right balance?
I'm going to make a confession, which is that I was given, as you might expect, a briefing note for this event. And the briefing note I received told me there are great sensitivities about national statistical offices within the World Bank, but it didn't tell me what those sensitivities were. And so I feel like I need to respect those sensitivities in answering these questions, but I unfortunately don't know how. And those of you who have followed my career will know that even when I thought I was respecting sensitivities, I often have not done such a great job. And therefore, speaking in an area where I know there are sensitivities but don't know what they are, I'm particularly alarmed. So I'm gonna resort to a favorite World Bank platitude, which I think has the virtue of being true in this area, which is a call for a balanced approach. By the way, in the entire history of the World Bank, I'm not aware of a single occasion on which there was a call for an unbalanced approach to any problem. So I think I'm on safe ground in calling for a balanced approach. Here's what I mean by that. I think any developing country that follows the recapitulation model for developing statistics is making a serious mistake. The recapitulation model in embryology is the idea, which has been largely discredited, that if you look at the development of a human embryo, first it looks like a single-celled organism, then it looks like a very simple organism, then it looks like a very complex organism. And so it goes through all the stages of evolution on the way to becoming a baby. And in the same way, a developing country that tries to have a statistical agency that first looks like Canada's did in 1940, then looks like Norway's did in 1960, then looks like America's did in 1980, then looks like Japan's did in 2000, is, I think, making a mistake. I think just as my remarks about no phone wires, never having a phone conversation on wires suggest that there really is very large capacity for leapfrogging, and it's a good idea. At the same time, I think that some of my friends in Silicon Valley envision a kind of libertarian paradise in which people can just kind of go use their cell phones and scan in their stuff from the cell phones, and then by magic it'll all get processed and it will all come together. It reminds me of the congressman who wanted to eliminate funding for the Weather Bureau on the grounds that the private sector did it fine with the Weather Channel, kind of oblivious to the issue of where the Weather Channel got its data. And so I think that the right model is almost certainly a more decentralized model with more contracting out than has been historically standard in the industrial countries, but a model that says that the ultimate public good, data, is no longer a public responsibility and can simply be outsourced to the private sector is, I think, a deeply flawed idea. And so my instincts would be very much on the side of a balanced approach.
Okay, we have a very balanced approach. Oh, you're splitting up now? I thought you two were going to do it together.
Can you address my last question? And it was on Statistics Bureau.
All right, perfect. So fire away.
We actually worked together, so
I could see
our
that,
powers
actually.
combined.
Yeah.
Professor Summers, I want to say thank you for coming. And at another talk, I heard you talk about the ecosystem that's necessary to support better data. And kind of building on what you talked about in a more decentralized approach to statistics agencies, the World Bank and my institution, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, we spend a lot of time and resources in generating better data, but less on the demand side, less on uptake and supporting policymakers to demand that data. So I'm curious if you had to say, what is the top priority in kind of supporting the uptake and use of the better data that we're generating?
Again, we are pushing the edges of my knowledge or competence, but I guess historically that has not deterred me, and so perhaps it should not deter me now. Let me, if you'll indulge me in just a little story from my father's career. I think it carries a important moral for answering your question. My father and his colleagues, Irv Kravis and Al Heston, had worked for many years on this international comparison data, and they really thought this data was the right way to think about a whole set of questions, and almost any question that involved cross-country research and comparative research across countries on questions of economic growth. And my father was, I think it's fair to say, substantially frustrated that it wasn't used enough. And then he had the idea, and you'll see when I describe the literal idea that it was a long time ago, that if he put all the data in an entirely straightforward way on a diskette and made that diskette widely available so that it would take a graduate student or an economic theorist 15 minutes from the time they got the data till the time they could do statistical analyses on the data would get used far more often than if it took 3 days to merge and combine the data. And sure enough, the approach produced a spectacular success in his terms, which was having his data used. And I would argue that what came out of all of those studies was actually substantially valuable in terms of enhancing the study of economic growth. But I think there is a tendency for data collectors not to put themselves in mind of data users and not to make it maximally easy to use the data to do the kinds of studies that people want. And so I think my recommendation would to the MCC or to the World Bank would be to think a great deal about data accessibility. I would also say, and this is now going to be quite controversial among the more statistically scientific among you, is that Keynes famously said something like that it's better to be wrong about the right question than right about the wrong question. You know, what is somebody supposed to do with a 2011 global poverty count? All they really care about is what the global poverty count is today. They can try to make an estimate. They can think about it and say, well, if it was X million people in 2011, it's probably Y million people in 2016. But I promise the World Bank can do that thought process better than the average person picking up that data in 2011. And so doing much more to provide extrapolations, interpolations, projections, extensions of data so that there are fuller tableaus that at least represent an attempt to answer the questions people care about rather than just describing the measurements that have been taken, would, I think, have a substantial effect on how much the data were employed. So I guess I would say make it maximally accessible for use and provide data that even if you have to introduce noise, it's better to have a noisy estimate. A noisy best estimate of what people care about will ultimately be much more impactful than a less noisy estimate of something that's kind of relevant to what they care about, but not what they actually care about. And those would be my thoughts about extending the use of data. But I just want to say that maybe in conclusion, that one of the most important failings everywhere in public policy is I believe that people devalue long policy chains and overvalue short policy chains. That's why when some idiot sails his boat in a hurricane, the Coast Guard spends tens of millions of dollars to save the idiot, but we pass up opportunities to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to save hundreds of children from leaded water in Flint. And in the same way, nobody ever says thank you. Let me put it more sharply, none of the millions of people whose lives were saved because statistical research showed that tobacco killed people have ever turned to a statistician and thanked them. Not once in all of human history has that happened, and yet millions of people's lives have been saved. And for that reason, I believe the world profoundly underinvests in data collection and statistics. And while it's not what comes to mind first when one thinks of vision, I believe it really is visionary leadership to initiate and to carry on the collection of a richer, broader array of statistics. Because believe me, as the examples I've given suggest, and many more that I could give suggest, nothing counts more than what you count. Thank you.
Larry Summers, thank you very much indeed. So as we say goodbye with great, profound gratitude to Larry for coming, for his remarks this morning, let me introduce Nada Hamade. Nada's a senior economist and runs the ICP here at the bank. We'll start our panels then, and thank you again, Larry. Nada Hamade, friends.